Welcome back to another episode of the Frustrated CEO podcast. My name is Patrick Lyons. I am one of your co-hosts. I'm here with another of my co-hosts, Patsy Freeman. Patsy, good morning and welcome to you.
Hey, glad to be here.
Yeah. Now, we are without our third cohort and partner in crime, Leb Tannenbaum. Leb celebrated his 75th birthday this past weekend, and I don't think he has fully recovered yet. So he'll join us for sure in a future episode. But today, Patsy and I are, not flying solo. We are here to welcome a couple of guests, two people that we have known for a number of years that we are certain you, our CEO listener, will learn a lot from. Now, we're actually going to do something a little bit different, beginning to do this now in future episodes. Rather than do one longer episode, we're going to break this into two parts. So for part one, they'll be our guests for both episodes, but part one, we want to talk about the values of having a clear direction, having a clear plan that can guide you in your leadership decisions. And to help us do that today, we are welcoming to the program Carina Hamel and Robby Ringer. Let's start with Robby. Robby Ringer grew up in Red Lodge, Montana, as an alpine racer. With a love for the mountains, Robby was exposed to the endurance world through mountain biking and through cross-country running. Now, from a young age, Robby's parents made fun of him for endlessly tinkering. With a degree in finance from Gonzaga University, Robby found his creative side post-college and has a serious passion for graphic and industrial design. He has led the design and development of Bivo and can be the person to thank for the clean, easy path of water that a Bivo bottle delivers to your mouth. Easier to read, harder to say. Outside of work, Robby can be found making play boats for his daughter Svea, or his son Nolan, reading architecture magazines, and riding, running, or skiing. Now, his partner Carina Hamel was also born into cross-country skiing, also born into sports, into cross-country skiing family in Western Massachusetts. From a young age, she chased the older kids and fell completely in love with racing. In her skiing career, she was a member of the U.S. World Junior Ski Team and raced for the University of Vermont. After retiring from racing, Carina found her passion for international business through footwear development at Keen in Portland, Oregon. After establishing manufacturing relationships across the globe, she founded 9 Concept Creation in 2012, which was a footwear agency she ran with Robby until 2022. And we can talk a little bit about that today as well. Together, Robby and Carina had the idea of Bivo and have been working at building the brand since 2019. When she's not working on bottles, Carina loves exploring and cuddling with Svea and Nolan, and hopefully Robby occasionally with you too, and strategizing a new business idea and getting outside for a run, a ride, or a ski. Now, when I think of Carina and Robby, I think they are two of the nicest people on the planet, and they are serial entrepreneurs. When we reconnected a few weeks ago, you mentioned that you wouldn't be where you are today if it hadn't been for the work that we did together a number of years ago, creating a plan, getting everything out of your head and into a formal plan that you could follow. So talk about what has the value been to you of having a simple, clear, strategic plan, something that you can follow to make these business ideas happen?
Yeah, so when we first met, we had just had our first child, Svea, and I was trying to come back to work. And to be totally honest, I was not that excited about it. I wanted a change, and we had so many ideas. And I think that we were a little bit jumbled and weren't exactly sure how to chase after all of them. And so we were definitely having a hard time figuring out exactly what our next steps were. And then we met with you and Leb, and we sat down and just created a plan. And I think the biggest thing that made a difference for us was that we set aside time for something different. It wasn't defined. And I think that works really well for my personality, because I'm I don't actually, if I have like something too defined, it stifles me a little bit. So having something that was just like other and creating that space and giving ourselves permission to have that space was a huge part in creating Bivo. And it was amazing to just have that time where we're like, yep, we're just going to be focusing on something different. We don't know what it is, but something will come about. And within, I don't know, 3 months, that Bivo came into our heads. So it was definitely important for us to create that plan, to just like actually not have too much of a plan, which is kind of ironic, but it definitely worked for us.
I think the other thing too is like, by doing that, by the time Bivo hit us, we were ready to pounce. It wasn't just another idea that you kind of like run up against a barrier of like, are we really going to do this? Like, we had already worked through this. Like, we had, on my side, I definitely operate a little bit more in the numbers world and the planning world. So like, well, maybe it wasn't as concrete for Carina. It was quite concrete for me. And I would say I had like the confidence once it happened to just keep putting one foot in front of the other, which was huge.
Yeah, I think the other thing in that is that we do tend to have a lot of ideas. And I think that sometimes when you have so many ideas, it's hard to pick one and then move forward, or even just three and then move forward. And so the plan that we created with you definitely helped us say, okay, we definitely need to focus on something and explore. And we can go down a path for a while. And if it doesn't feel right, we can abandon it. And we actually did that with another idea. And so, I think that was important for us too, just like making sure that we keep exploring, but then once we get further down the road, we have to pick and abandon other tasks.
Yeah, and I think this is not. I know this is relevant to. You're talking about different businesses, right? Different, but even to a CEO who's listening today, who is thinking, well, that's not in our future. We have one business. That's what we're doing. There's still product development. You still have multiple ideas that are brought to you during the course of the business cycle. That like, okay, here's a product. Here's a direction we can go. Here's a direction we can go. Here's a direction we can go. Absolutely, I think the process of planning and to your point, narrowing it down, getting that focus. I remember when we worked together to create the plan, I don't think we spent a lot of time really digging into what all the different ideas were. To your point, it was just what you knew together is you knew that we want to launch another company within a certain period of time. Like that much we knew. And do you remember what was the process of narrowing down all of those ideas into the one? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I was in the innovation department at Keen Footwear. So I in my time there, part of what we did was come up with ideas. We would say, okay, let's have 10. And then we'll do a little research into each, and then we'll narrow it down to 3. And then we'll start digging even deeper. And we did very similar to that when we were coming up with the idea of Bivo. So we had multiple ideas. We had a footwear development agency prior to this. And honestly, part of what we wanted to do was create a little bit more stability, something that was potentially sellable or that didn't have the ups and downs of the consulting world. And so we knew that we wanted it to be a product company. That was something that we are super passionate about. We love creating new products and coming up with ideas, particularly in the sports space. That's why I think we had you talk a little bit about our sports background, just because that's something that we're super passionate about. So for us, it was coming up with actual product ideas. And then after we came up with those ideas, looking to see if it was a viable business. Like we actually came up with some ideas around the sport of cross-country skiing, because that's what we do a lot together. And then we quickly dug into it and we're like, there's just not enough people who do this sport to make it a good business. So, and then there are other things that were like, maybe it's going to be too expensive of a product. The water bottle space is kind of an interesting one because it's a good gift opportunity. It's a reasonable price point. And so we would really analyze what type of business our idea could turn into and how viable of an option that would be.
So you've mentioned a couple of times the things that you value and that are kind of core to you. Can you talk a little bit more about having a plan or getting very succinct in your direction, how that helped you?
Yeah. It's funny. We were just talking about this, and we obviously have these two different businesses we're talking about. This footwear agency that we together for almost 10 years, and then in Bivo. And some of these values, which make sense, have like transitioned with us into these other businesses. Is obviously who we are. One, we talk a lot about it, and what we wanted to do is work with good people who care. That's like always been like our motto, is our motto in the consulting world. And I think it's something we've really taken seriously in Bivo too. Like, we self-funded Bivo, and that was this will circle around in a second, but we did that for a variety of reasons. But we saw so many startups in the world of consulting on footwear and helping people manufacture footwear. Like, we saw what worked, and we saw a lot what didn't work, and we didn't want to go out and raise tons of money through VCs and not necessarily know who we were working with. Those relationships happen pretty quick, and sometimes you get into sticky situations where it just doesn't work out. I would say we probably took a harder path, more challenging path. It's been tough, obviously, self-funding it, but like, we very adamantly like wanted to work with good people we had existing relationships with who really cared. That's a huge one. We can probably talk about that for a while. But another one that I think is really worth touching base on is just, we say feel more fun at Bivo. It's kind of become one of our taglines, but honestly, we followed our passions and how to eliminate these ideas. And Bivo is something that we were like giddy about. And we both come from endurance sport backgrounds, and biking is something that we both actually didn't do competitively growing up, but that we both did together non-competitively once we came together and got married. And I think just the fact of focusing on feel more fun is just like, it's continued to be something that's allowed us to focus on, I guess, where the energy is and like what means the most to us. And I think there's a lot of ideas that were great ideas, but they just didn't sound fun. That seems like such a like basic like way to eliminate things, but if you don't have that, it's quite hard to continue to get up every morning when it gets tough and put another foot in front of the last one. So
yeah, like we work a lot of events on the weekends, and we bring our kids with us, and it's a community of people that we love being around. And so for us, if it's a Saturday morning and we go to an event and our kids are running around with their bikes, and people help take care of them and entertain them, it's just like a really cool community to be part of. And so it's more of like, it's our life, it's not just our business.
Yeah.
Well, Robby, you say it sounds obvious. However, I think I've experienced, and Pat would probably agree, it's so obvious it gets skipped over.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I like how it's kind of like your stake in the ground that it's kind of like your tuning fork, test everything against this. Yeah. So it's really good. And we'll shout out to all the CEOs out there that there's a really importance of knowing what at your core motivates you, that you can align all your other actions with. So
yeah,
it's so obvious it gets skipped over. Maybe.
It's a good way of putting it.
And I think often we think we have to sacrifice that in the name of whether it's profitability or efficiency or so Robby, you said we could talk about that for a while. I'd love to talk about that for a while. So in my mind, I guess the question, you said we only want to work with people we like. Did you go through a bunch of people in the process of finding that? Like what's the criteria? How do you measure that? Talk about it. Share some of the experience.
Yeah. That does. I mean, the reality is like, you're going to have to work with a variety of people. But we wanted to surround ourselves with a community. And I think like, if you look at Bivo, sometimes it's about the business to business relationships, but like Bivo is about like the industry, the cycling community, the endurance world that it lives within, that like really connects to us. And like, sure, on an individual level, I'm sure there's some bad people that we don't really want to work with, but like in a nutshell, like that world gives us energy, and like we're passionate about it, and we know that like people are there. And the cycling industry is an interesting one in general. It's not like the avid cyclist, I would say, is not a massive industry compared to some other sports categories, right? Like it's an interesting breed of people is what I'm trying to say. And like, they're there because they like it, they want to experience it. And we resonate with them. And I think it's like easy for us to like show up at an event and like to talk about something that's a little bit foreign, and we can get into more of the product and how Bivo's different if we want to, but we're the first metal bottle to fit into a bike cage, and it weighs more and is strange in that world, it's easy for us to show up with like-minded people and to pitch our business and like to connect with them. So just like, I think it breaks down barriers too, if you will, to focus on the good people who care, if you will. I would say it's like the good industry that cares.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what you just described is actually counterintuitive to the kind of more traditional business model, which is I've got a product to sell and I'm going to sell it to you, as opposed to can I connect with you from a place that we both care from? And oh, by the way, we've got something that might improve your life, your cycling, your sports. So
absolutely. Yeah, you know, maybe this is a tangent, but we have so many people tell us, well, why aren't you focusing on other sports? And you're so focused on the cycling world, like your bottle looks great everywhere. And like, I think the first thing both of us say is like, we know that, like we've surveyed our customers and we know that like 95% plus of people use our bottle outside of cycling. But we have been really focused in this world because of exactly what you're saying, Patsy. I think you can create a much like stronger brand value and stronger awareness. I think in those initial conversations, when it's not just like, buy this bottle, it's great, it's cheaper, it's, I don't know, it's faster. It's more like we're here on Saturday doing something that we both love. And, you know, the last 10% of the conversation is like, oh, well, it costs $39. Do you want to buy one? Versus like the inverse. So it definitely becomes easier. And it's something that I think we've really focused on.
Yeah, and I think it's an industry we understood completely, which was also huge for us. And that's what I think, like having that light bulb moment of, wow, there is not a metal bike water bottle out there. Like, how is this not a thing? That was so exciting for us because we knew how it could impact the cycling industry and how we could integrate within that community too, which was huge for us.
So I'm thinking about you launched this idea. You started building the brand in 2019, and then a year later, there's this thing called the pandemic that hits. How did having a plan? Because I'm sure you had one, right? How did having the plan help you navigate through that? I'm thinking about when you were together running the footwear company. I mean, you did a lot of traveling globally, visiting your vendors, your partners, suppliers. I mean, you had tremendous relationships built. You can't do that during the pandemic. You're building a product, physical product. You need suppliers and vendors, and logistics went to hell. I mean, how did having a plan help you through all of that?
Well, this was another time where we did have to pivot a little bit. I mean, we had the foundation. I think that was the biggest piece for us, is we had the foundation of a lot of experience on the ground in Asia. We make these water bottles in China. We actually had a team on the ground there too for our footwear business. So that was helpful in that we actually had people we could communicate, and we've had already worked with for years before this in helping us manufacture the bottles without being able to go. But I will say that we are like number one rule for any new client that we worked with. We worked with a lot of startups in footwear. And so we would go through the first production run with a lot of different clients. And we always said, you can never go through your first production run without being on the ground to oversee production. And so this was a time where we couldn't do that. We actually, March 2020 hit, then April 2020, we were looking at placing our first order, and we're like, should we really do this? Like, this is kind of a crazy time to start a business. And then we did hold for a couple of weeks. We're kind of like, let's just like see what happens here. This is kind of scary. And then we saw that a lot of people are getting outside and a lot of people are riding bikes, and that perhaps it would actually be an opportune time for us to start a bike water bottle company. So we placed the purchase order, and the first production batch came into our warehouse, which was actually my parents in Massachusetts, because we lived there with them during the pandemic for help with our first kid. And the batch was bad. So we had actually launched on just like a pre-order campaign and we were about to ship out all of our bottles, and we had to delay.
Morning of
Yeah.
shipping,
Of course.
Yeah.
and pulled the plug,
which was super devastating. But I think that this is one of those, actually, just before this, just before this talk, we looked back through our document we had gone through with you, Patrick, and quality was one of our values that we had talked about. And quality was always important for us for our footwear business. And that also has transferred into Bivo. And we knew that we couldn't put a bad product out there. There were like 50% of the bottles were okay. It was hard to tell which ones were good and which ones were bad, because it was actually it was an aesthetic problem with the coating on the outside started peeling off. So the bottles actually performed fine. We probably could have shipped the bottles, but that was against who we were. Like we couldn't send out bad product. And so we held it. We sent out an email that was like very hard for us to write. It was honestly quite embarrassing. And financially, like Robby said, we were self-funding. So it was a lot for us to postpone, and we weren't sure what that was going to mean for Bivo. But we delayed, and we remade the first batch, and we were able to launch that December. And we gained a lot of support through that time, actually, through a lot of the customers that had placed orders for those bottles. And I think that people really appreciated the fact that we do believe that quality is important, and they probably trusted us more from that point forward. So that was a good example of when you have a value, like you can't stray from it, because if we'd shipped those, we don't know where Bivo would be today, but we are where we are, and we have good product for it.
But I'm also hearing, you know, your value. You paused to align with your value. You communicated what needed to be communicated from your value. And those things, you could sweep past any of those things very quickly, especially if it's the morning of and it's your first shipment. And I mean, it's just like all my bells and whistles are going off. So, and did it help that there were the two of you?
Yes,
For sure.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, we have. I mean, we talked about this quite a bit, but like, I think it either, obviously, we're a couple. You guys know that. I think everybody listening knows that by now. But I think we joke, like, I think it's either gonna work great or not work really quickly, and we figured that out. And we were fortunate that it worked for us to work together. And I think, I mean, I wouldn't trade it for anything. And I think part of it is like coming home, like, especially in the startup world, it's stressful. And in the consulting world, it was stressful. You know, jobs are stressful at times, and we can relate to it so easily. And I think, like, I don't know, it has made it easier to get through those tough times. Like, we're both in it for very similar, like, beliefs and reasons, I think. And when it gets tough, like, we can kind of come down to each other's level, and we're pretty good problem solvers. And that is, you know, something we had to do a lot of when we started Bivo. But, you know, I would say, Patrick, you asked like about the plan when COVID struck. I think less of the plan changed and more of like you kind of like, you know, work your way from 30,000 feet and like creating a business, like downwards into the details. And I felt like we had to like fly back up a little bit and go like, does this make sense? And kind of like change your filter a little bit and go like, did anything change or not? And like, we definitely paused for a while and pumped the brakes. And luckily, like, the plan itself, or what Bivo was, and the values we were taking into it, like, it still made sense. Luckily, people got outside a lot more during the pandemic, so it was surprisingly a really good entry point for us. Most people would have said probably the opposite, but a few months into the pandemic, the bike world was going like this. So
yeah, I remember, like bike shops were flying. I mean, they couldn't even keep bikes in, right? They were flying out of the stores
Yeah.
Carina, you mentioned early on, and I think when we met, we had a cup of coffee downtown Portland, and it was right after you had your first child. And I remember you speaking about, you know, going back to work, you know, just the stress alone, the motivation, the desire. How did the work that we did together, creating a plan, how did that help you re-engage? Or not, I mean, because you were engaged. So like re-engage makes it sound like you were disengaged. It's not what I mean. But how did it light that fire again? And if so, how?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think I just did something new to work on. I think I needed a new challenge. I like challenges. I like problem solving, and yeah, I wanted something different that was motivating me to spend time, honestly, to spend time away from our daughter. It was super weird because I never expected to feel that way. It was like I thought I would have a baby, take a few months off, come back, no problem. But I just needed something new. And I think that I mentioned it earlier in this conversation, just giving ourselves the permission to think differently. That was huge for me. I think just knowing like, okay, if I'm spending 20% of my time on something that I don't even know what it's for, but I'm like putting trust in the fact that there's probably something good that will come out of that, that gave me energy. That gave me a lot of energy. And I think I've read, after the return rate for women after they come back from babies, if they have at least 4 months off, they're like way more likely to come back if they have only had 3 compared to if they've only had 3 months off. And I think it's different every pregnancy is different. Even with our son, it was very different for me to come back than it was for me to come back with our daughter. And I just needed that time and that flexibility. So that permission was huge for me. And it's weird because it was like you helped me have that permission, but it's like really permission from ourselves to do it. And that's like something that's super hard to do, especially if it's like, you tell people about your day and you're like, just I wasn't working on anything specific.
And yet, I mean, obviously being a stay-at-home parent that's a full-time job. So
yeah, I could not do that.
So you weren't working on anything specific in the business, but you were certainly busy.
No, but I mean, when I wasn't working on something specific for the business, but at the office working towards something that it was like working towards an unknown.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And I think you're busting another myth about leadership is that, we have to learn to lead ourselves first. We need to know our own selves and our own values and what motivates us, and also give ourselves permission to be our authentic selves, because that's when we do our best work.
Yeah. That's another one. I think we've worked a lot just for the two of us as working together, like making sure we understand each other. And I think in the beginning, we actually thought we were like very similar. And now we've realized that we're very different in terms of personality, and we each need different things. I cannot be told what to do, or like I can't have to have deliverables as much as probably other, like what Robby might want. And so I think like understanding each other and what he needs and then what I need, that's also been hugely helpful in running Bivo. And I think like just from, if you ever have like a co-founder, if they're not your husband or wife or partner, that's a huge thing I think that people should work on too, is understanding each other and what each person needs. And I think like just having employees and analyzing their personalities and like the type of work that helps them excel and find energy, that finding the energy thing is so important. I think it's overlooked a lot. So,
and that's a great lead into a question. We are, each of us are, as we work with clients to create strategic plans, we're often not trumpeting the importance of a strategic plan, but we are more so trumpeting the importance of alignment around the plan, because it's one of the first things that kills execution is creating a plan and really not like thinking that we're aligned, but finding out when we go to execute it that we're really not. Either we didn't have the conversations we needed to have in the room, we were avoiding the difficult things, or you thought it meant one thing, I thought it meant something else. And so as you created your plan, you are partners in this. How do you, and you have employees, how have you stayed aligned? What are some of the challenges of staying aligned? And then part two of that is, how do you stay aligned? How do you present a unified face, a unified front to your employees when you are misaligned?
Looking at me. I mean, so I would say we're good at talking about plans and having a plan written down, and like we have a 4-year financial plan and it's got a lot of details, like yada yada yada. I'm not discrediting that. That's like my world, but like it is not the sole thing that we continue to go back to in terms of running our business. And if we're off, like we're very good at pivoting, and I think part of that probably comes from our world, just working with so many startups and just kind of seeing it be a need, like something that's forced upon most startups, unless somehow you hit the holy grail of it just works and it's straight path. We constantly challenge, I would say, is probably one of our biggest strengths. Play devil's advocate, whatever you want to call it. Like we're constantly challenging things. Just like I think when the pandemic struck at the beginning, we kind of like like I said, kind of backed up out of the details to maybe closer to a 20,000 foot view. We do that a lot. And I would say we also really go with our gut very well. We do a lot of research, but then we also, there's always a piece of the puzzle that like is your gut. And when our gut's telling us something different, that kind of signifies that we better like take a step back. In terms of with our team and how we communicate that, and what I was alluding to, like not having, like we're probably, I'm not going to use the word fail, but we're not as good as some at having a concrete plan and like individual plans for employees, but we're very good at talking to our employees regularly and constantly having this like two-way communication. So some of the things we always ask ourselves, in particular when our gut's like telling us something is amiss, is like, what's working, what's not working? What should we do more of, and what should we do less of? And we just had this conversation with our team recently, just because the environment in the bike world has changed a lot since when the pandemic struck. For example, like Patrick, you alluded to, like you couldn't get a bike. There was no bikes. Well, fast forward now, kind of the opposite's happened a little bit. And there's tricky situation with like overstocked inventories. And what does that mean with Bivo as a new brand trying to get into more retailers across the country? So I would say we're very good at communicating. It's less like written and concrete. It's more two-way dialogue so that we are aligned, but have the chance to pivot together, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's great.
I think we also recognize each other's strengths. And sometimes like I really lean on Robby for his ability to create a plan. And I need that often. And then he also, I think, looks at me sometimes like the gut thing. We talk about this a lot, like go with your gut. And sometimes there's just something, both of us, I think we both have the ability to do that, where we're like, I think especially because we're in the cycling industry, like we talked about, where we're like, we know it and we can kind of see trends. That's been part of our jobs for 10 plus years of like understanding trends in business, and how does that relate to what we're trying to create with Bivo, and how does that relate in terms of like, how do we change our plan a little bit in terms of what our budgets are and what's not working and what is, and knowing that we are doing this from like as bootstrapped of a way as possible. We can't just stick to what works on a piece of paper. It has to also be part of what we think might actually end up working. And sometimes we're wrong, and hopefully we're often more right. Beautiful.
All right, we are right about at the 30-minute mark. Patsy, any final questions from you, which certainly allowed?
Nope.
Okay,
we're good to wrap this one up.
So what if let's get practical on this episode, and then we can close this and bring you back for part 2 in the next episode. So this is the part, our listeners know this, Carina and Robby, this is part of every interview where the question is, what can our CEO listener do? What advice would you have for a listener, whether it's startup or whether it's an established leader who's trying to navigate through managing a behemoth organization? What can a leader do beginning today, beginning tomorrow, to start making inroads in planning, executing anything that we've talked about today, or perhaps anything we didn't, that you just think, oh, this is some advice I would share?
For me, the biggest one, and I have to listen to this more often because it's hard to do, because they're like your plate just gets so full, but creating space to just have something to work on outside of what your day-to-day really is. And I think when you create that space, you come up with some pretty interesting ideas.
Good.
I should have gone first because that was mine, but there is another one, so I'll add to it. I would say what I just said in that last kind of question, the two questions about what should we do more of, what should we do less of. Like we go back to that so often, and I think, like Carina said, you're always just like blasted by opportunities, and like I'm constantly like battling down the like stress or anxiety of like what should I focus on, and sometimes like just simplifying it to two questions somehow makes it easier. Give yourself the space, take yours, and do that.
Great.
Yeah. Great.
Patsy, what would you add?
Well, yes, and right before that, I love that you are willing. So it would be willing to challenge assumptions. You know, that's one thing that space allows you. I also like, or think it's understand each person, what motivates each person, how they operate, and honor that.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big thing.
Most people don't get to the first one, much less the second part of that. So,
agreed. Any more, Patsy?
I'll see what you've got. I'll leave.
Okay. All right. I have a few that I'll add, and then we'll circle back, see if anybody wants to add anything. I love what you were talking about, launching a business in the middle of a pandemic. This has come up in other episodes. There is opportunity in every pivot. There's opportunity in every pivot. So the pandemic comes, and if you weren't paying attention to the trends, you would have missed. Everybody's getting outside, and that creates an opportunity for you. So I love what you were talking about, being clear about your values and including them in your planning, and then let them be the guide as you're executing the plan. You spoke about quality eloquently and how that ultimately costs you money, but it probably saved you a lot in reputation. Carina, I loved when you were talking about creating, and this is even CEOs who aren't necessarily launching something new. It can become very routine, and how creating a plan can reignite the fire. It can reignite the passion. It gives you focus and something to shoot for. So if you're needing that jolt, then sometimes creating the plan, getting those ideas out of your head, can be the spark that reignites the fire. And then the last one I will add is you talked about continually challenge the plan, and I mean, be ready and willing to pivot whenever it's called for. We talk about that. You don't want to stick so tightly to your plan that you miss the opportunities, or you're excluding new information. So good stuff. Anybody want to add any others?
I think to your point about the plan, like sticking to the plan. And I think when you have too many ideas, which I think happens a lot, because even in big organizations, you have a lot of people with ideas, and there's so many good ones out there. I think sometimes you get overwhelmed, and then you don't act on any of them. So I think like whittling it down and honing in on some of those opportunities, that's where it gets so valuable, because it just creates some clarity for you.
Yep. And the note that I took on that one is narrow those ideas with research. What are the trends? What are you passionate about? What's the need in the market, and what are your customers wanting? Those are some of the questions to use to help narrow that list of many ideas down into the few good ones. Anybody want to add anything else? Good. Okay. I see heads nodding. Listener, thank you for sticking with us to the end of part 1 of our conversation with Carina and Robby. You can download this episode of Let's Get Practical from our website at thefrustratedceo.com. But stick with us, or I guess look for part 2 of our conversation, where we're going to spend time talking about how do you make decisions, those tough and inspiring ones, along the path of actually executing your strategic plan. Thanks for sticking with us to the end, and we'll see you again next time on the Frustrated CEO podcast. Thanks, everybody.